Welcome back to the Movie Maker. So today I'm making a video to finally talk to you about Dune. I promised you last time I made a video on the spur of the moment because I was very annoyed that Warner postponed the movie Dune by a year. It was supposed to be released November 18th in France, then December 18th in Italy, but it was postponed until October 2021. It was a pretty angry video where I said a lot of stuff, but rather confusedly. Today, however, we're really going to talk about Dune. We now have all the time to do it, and it's not even certain this will be the only Dune video I make because we've got a year, whatever it is, to talk about it. Dune is a novel, or rather a series of novels, a cycle, as they say, consisting of 6 novels. The first one actually came out in installments, as was more common at the time, in short in the 60s, and then the publisher convinced Frank Herbert, the author of Dune, to merge these 8 episodes into a single book. And from there, the first Dune book was born, which then came out in 1965. There are 6 novels, I'll list them for you. Dune from 65, Messiah of Dune from 69, Children of Dune from 77, which is the only other novel from which a terrible movie, or rather TV adaptation, was attempted. We'll talk more about that later. God, Emperor of Dune from 1981, Heretics of Dune from 84, released at the same time as the only noteworthy Dune movie, at least what we have, namely that by David Lynch and Chapter House Dune from 1985. Other films have since been released, set in the universe created by Frank Herbert, written by his son. But for now, we won't touch on those. We're not interested, at least not for the moment. Who was Frank Herbert? A writer, but who came from a somewhat different background. He was someone who also dealt with the environment, even scientific studies, and that's very evident in Dune. Nowadays, considering that the value of the environment is very important at last in recent years, we can also look at Dune a lot from this so important aspect. Dune is set on a planet also known by the name of Dune in this science fiction setting, but its name is Arrakis. This planet has a characteristic. It's the only one in the known universe of this great Herbert cycle where a spice is produced. It's called melange, and it serves several purposes. So, now the spice, take this with a grain of salt, but actually it's the truth underlying Dune. It's sort of a drug, a metaphor, not too much of a metaphor for drugs, basically. So much so that this was supposed to be the interpretation of the person who first tried to make a film adaptation of this great novel, Alejandro Jodorowsky, between the end of the 70s and the start of the 80s, which then failed. He wanted to recreate a film that would give, according to Jodorowsky, often the effects of drugs, so a sensation of psychedelia without using drugs, just by watching the film. This is because there's precisely this reference to this spice, the melange, which is a kind of herb, let's call it, which is born only on this planet and in the entire universe, and which serves to do a series of things. First of all, it extends the length, the duration of life. The emperor of this universe, of Dune and of all the known planets, Padishah IV, the emperor, head of the galactic empire, is about 200 years old, for example. But if you look at him, even in the film, he is a 60-year-old man, basically. The heads of the Space Guild, which deals with transports between planets, have lived for tens, hundreds of years exactly thanks to the use of this melange. The melange, the spice, serves this purpose, but it also serves to cancel space-time and make intergalactic travel at the speed of light even faster. George Lucas drew from many other sources to create his original Star Wars trilogy. George Lucas himself has said that without Dune, Star Wars would not have existed. He took many cues to create the fantastical world of Star Wars, just like Herbert constructed this amazing universe of planets and noble houses of essentially rivaling families who are part of this Lanzarad, a collective of noble families in the universe that take turns managing the production, or rather the extraction of the spice melange from the planet Arrakis, the planet of Dune. We can say the Emperor assigns these families the task of extracting the spice used for space travel, elongating life, and enhancing the perception of existence. So if this isn't a metaphor for drugs, I'm not exactly talking about drugs, but it's, very obvious that this is also discussed in the Dune universe. What happens in Dune? I won't spoil anything. Of course, I recommend you read at least the first novel before the new movie comes out, not least because it will be very interesting to see the film adaptation by Denis Villeneuve, who was then the director of a not-too-terrible sequel to Blade Runner 2049, released in 2017, which was the sequel to Ridley Scott's Blade Runner from '82. What is happening on the planet Arrakis? The management of the Harkonnen family, which then is the bad guys in Dune, is dwindling, and the Emperor is about to give, say, the Atreides family control of spice extraction on Dune. But there's a problem with Dune. There are giant sandworms because Dune is a planet completely sandy, which has never seen a single second of rainfall in its entire history. So the problem with Dune is that it's a planet without water, basically, but the only planet where the spice exists. This is just to briefly tell you a little about the themes of Dune and a little about the history of Dune. Although I recommend you read, I repeat, the book and watch, without a shadow of doubt, the first film adaptation of 1984. At the beginning, as I had anticipated, Jodorowsky, successful with his previous films. Jodorowsky is a director, but also a writer. He's a therapist, in short. He's a handful. He has a very complex personality. Go and read a little about Jodorowsky on Wikipedia. Naturally, he fears this transposition and works very hard. He creates a film completely already laid out with a storyboard. In one of my previous videos, I talked about the use of the storyboard by directors like Alfred Hitchcock, who would absolutely never go on set without a solid storyboard, because for these types of directors, it is very important to have the whole film already in their head, essentially everything they will do. Jodorowsky worked exactly like this, but unfortunately no one ever had the guts, or perhaps fortunately, who knows, to produce Jodorowsky's Dune, because Dune is a cursed film. It's a complex film. It's a novel cursed to be cinematographically transposed. We'll later see also Lynch and the TV series. We'll briefly talk about it because Dune is complex. It's a complex novel because it's not just a novel that talks about science fiction. It's a bit like Star Wars, yes, but exponentially more, because within Dune there are themes of environmentalism, themes of philosophy, of religion. I'm not going to reveal anything because I truly invite you to read it. Jodorowsky's Dune was supposed to involve several big names, this film that was never made. Dali, for instance, had given his nod to play Emperor Padishak IV. Orson Welles was even supposed to play Baron Harkonnen, thus the villain of the film Dune. Pink Floyd was supposed to do the soundtrack for Jodorowsky's film, which then involved also Geiger, who is practically the designer and great illustrator, large designer of monsters, let's say, to whom we owe The Creature of Alien in the first Alien by Ridley Scott from the end of the 70s, and next, in that of James Cameron, and next to come. a cartoonist who has unfortunately passed away, who then revisited all the material he worked on with Jodorowsky and unfortunately never saw his Dune project, which ended up being turned into a comic book story, a series of comic book stories, to be honest. The most famous one is this here, Jodorowsky Moebius Linkle, fully integrated into the mysteries of Linkle. This is a Mondadori edition, beautiful and massive, because it contains all the stories that have been, let's say, revisited. Let me show you some illustrations. They're exceptional. This is all the work, let's say, created for Dune, in quotes, then revisited by this great French artist and illustrator, who practically designed and drew with Jodorowsky all of the production for Dune, which then exactly was transposed in a sense, creating a new story, but the work has been transposed here inside. So I recommend you to read this comic book, which is also quite extreme, philosophical, absolutely new, incredible in every sense. A comic that then came out in the 80s, if I'm not mistaken, because Jodorowsky, in fact, was not able to involve the big film productions. Or rather, it's the big film productions that didn't believe in Jodorowsky and never produced his film. In 1984, however, David Lynch, who was still quite young at the time, and produced by Dino De Laurentiis, created the cinematic Dune. Jodorowsky even goes to see it at the cinema. There's a brilliant documentary called Jodorowsky's Dune from 2013, if I'm not mistaken. Try to look for it, it's not easy to find, where Jodorowsky says I felt bad when they wanted to take me to the cinema to see the film that I hadn't been able to make. Then with names like Dali, Orson Welles, Pink Floyd, Geiger, Maddox, whom I was able to get involved because it probably would have been an extraordinary film, or probably it's better that it really remained a project because Jodorowsky is also a very complete person. He was probably also very arrogant from a certain point of view in wanting to transpose Dune in the way he wanted to do it. He wanted to change the ending and didn't want to respect the novel. He even says himself that he never even read the novel. That is a bit strange. David Lynch succeeds Jodorowsky when he sees it in the cinema. He rejoices because he says, I've never seen a film as bad as Dune. But he says it's definitely not David Lynch's fault, who is a director I admire. They definitely didn't let him work as he wanted, and that's fine. The Dune produced by Dino De Laurentiis, which was about $47 million at the time, were in the mid-80s. In 84 it came out. That wasn't even enough. Dino De Laurentiis had to put in another 7 to 8 million anyway. The film made about $30 to $35 million, something like that. So it was essentially a flop. It recovered a bit later with The Birth in the 80s, which was widely the era of video distribution, let's say a VHS, Laserdisc, and everything that came after. Needless to say, David Lynch's Dune remains a cult film for a whole series of reasons. It's a fundamental film for steampunk. What is steampunk? It's that literary and cinematic genre that imagines what the 19th century would have been like if technology arrived earlier. That is, if the technology we have now existed in the 19th century. Steampunk is this. So it carries a very 19th century atmosphere, but it's full of technology that could be considered a bit kitsch in a certain sense. It can either be liked or disliked. There are plenty of steampunk fans, myself included. I'm beginning to enjoy it. I'm starting to delve into the world of those who appreciate steampunk, envisioning this past as if technology had developed much sooner. So these scenarios are present. If you go watch Lynch's Dune, you'll get a sense of what I'm expressing. Even the part where they enter, executing these space travels and a small vessel enters the ship, which then will utilize the spice to journey through space, appears as if it fits into the frame of a 19th century painting, like it's entirely golden and stuff like that. Absurd, but most definitely a must-see. You might not necessarily like them, but the idea is to appreciate them, just like Lynch's film in general, although it features some truly intriguing appearances, such as Paul. For example, Paul Atreides, who's the scion of the Atreides house, and also the future Messiah, let's say, who will bring this order back to the universe, this Kwisatz Haderach, as they call him in the film, who will then go to the planet Dune to redeem the Freemen, who are these inhabitants of the planet Dune. For example, he is played by Kyle MacLachlan, very difficult to say his last name, who will then be a fetish actor for David Lynch. We see him in all the series of Twin Peaks, including the one of 2017, the third series revived again by Lynch, and we see him in many other films by Lynch, such as Blue Velvet of '86, it seems to me '87, so a couple of years later, and in many other transpositions, so many other films by Lynch above all. But he also participates in TV series such as Sex and the City, like in the '90s, so a very famous actor who I must say offers a, I don't want to say splendid interpretation, but still interesting interpretation. The film stars Max von Sydow, indeed, who is both the father and guide, a freeman for the Atreides in the world of Dune, of Arrakis, who is then the father of the freeman woman whom Paul will fall in love with, whom she calls Moebius, is the freeman name by which Paul Atreides, Moebius Kwisatz Haderach is known. In the novel and in the movie, I release plot gems gradually because I want to pique your interest. I don't want to tell everything about Dune because Dune is a beautiful and complex world to discover. There also are, let's say, a series of very important characters besides the Freeman, in addition to Baron Harkonnen, who is this floating man riddled with facial diseases. Actors like Sting, for example, who in the '80s plays Baron Harkonnen's nephew, who then has this final duel with Paul Atreides. Very interesting. And there are the Reverend Mothers, who are kind of seers, one might say, of the known world of Dune, in some ways rivals of the Space Guild, who are two, say, schools of thought that were formed after the world was somehow destroyed, the world of men, by machine technology, quite like what occurs, say, in Terminator from a certain perspective. So this is to make you understand Dune, how it inspired a whole other series of novels, films, transitions that would come later. So also watch Lynch's movie because it surely is worth seeing. In 2000 there was a new adaptation, not cinematography but television, a two-part miniseries, Dune of 2000 and The Children of Dune, which, as mentioned, is the adaptation of the third novel by Herbert in 2003, if I'm not mistaken, but both are very bad. Despite the Dune of 2000 having actors like Giancarlo Giannini, who plays Baron Harkonnen, if I'm not mistaken. But beyond that, he has our three-time Oscar winner for cinematography, Vittorio Storaro, whom I remember he won an Oscar for Red by Warren Beatty, for Apocalypse Now by Francis Ford Coppola, and for Bertolucci's film, if I'm not mistaken, The Last Emperor. I could be wrong, but it seems to me he won an Oscar 3 times for these 3 films. His photography is absolutely, I have to say it, terrible. Storaro, who was also my teacher at Cinecittà for cinema photography, will forgive me. It's really bad. I mean, you can see it's shot in Univision, the film that has a ratio of 1:2. Watch my old videos on the history of cinema to understand what I'm talking about formats. He created them, which involves a very interesting saving of film, etc. But he even did photography in which you can see the reflections of the lights on the bottom of the background panels that represent the backgrounds of the planet Arrakis. I mean, absolutely terrible things, a terrible adaptation, a terrible script, terrible photography. Unfortunately, I have to say that sometimes even the great masters can't make good films. Clearly, this is a film to absolutely avoid. I suggest you don't watch it and don't waste these 3 hours of your time on this adaptation, let's say, of 2000s TV, because it really doesn't make sense. I've already talked a lot. Let me show you the first Dune novel again. I will make more videos on Dune because I've been talking for 20 minutes already, because Dune is a wide world. There's really a lot you can say. Click like if you like the video, and if you want to ask me questions, if you want us to talk again about Dune, I will definitely do it, because Dune is a world kind of like saying, okay, let's talk about Star Wars. How do you make a video about Star Wars? You make a series of videos, of course. I also invite you to read, if you want, the Incal. That, absolutely yes, that is the comic book adaptation by Moebius and Jodorowsky, which is very, very beautiful and very interesting, especially from an illustration point of view, and I invite you to see it in any case, despite it being also considered a masterpiece of trash. But there's worse, meaning it's not that trashy. I also find that I didn't tell you, but I'll tell you before I leave you, there are two versions of David Lynch's Dune movie. One, the first, is the one, in quotes, recognized by the author. The other is the one directed by Alan Smith. He's a director who maybe you don't know, but I'll tell you why. It's a very interesting curiosity every time a Hollywood director disowns their own film. But it must be released anyway because it's already been produced. Otherwise, the studios would lose a lot of money. It's signed Alan Smith. So there's a filmography, even if you look on IMDb, the Internet Movie Database, for this Alan Smith, but he's a director, he's a man, a human being who doesn't exist. All of the films disowned by their authors are signed Alan Smith, and so he has his own filmography, but this person doesn't exist. It's like, it's a name, let's say, for disowning films. There's an Alan Smith version, which is always a recut of the production, not, let's say, stamped with David Lynch's name for sure, that you can find online, which has a version instead of 2 hours, like Lynch's film, of 3 hours and a quarter, if I'm not mistaken. That manages much better, so to speak, to make you understand. It's not known if these were the intentions, it's really David Lynch's initials, but anyway, you understand the cinematic transposition much better of this novel, which is very, very complex to transpose because it's a deeply philosophical novel. In 3 hours and 15 minutes, you comprehend what you would never understand by watching, indeed, Lynch's film of this novel, if you haven't read the novel at least. Well, surely that's the case. So I also invite you to see Alan Smith's version. Have fun with Dune and let me know what you think down in the comments, or commenting a bit on my Instagram page and all that. Whatever my social networks are in general, feel free to write to me wherever you want. I also invite you to watch nerddream.it, because soon I will post an article that talks about Dune's non-release and all the upcoming films that we await, all the films that, alas, are being delayed. Follow me on the channel, click like, invite your friends to click like. Bye.